Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lode-Holt. There was something in yesterday's gospel reading that really caught my attention in a way I had never really thought about it before. The gospel story was in part about a man with a withered hand and how in a synagogue on a Sabbath day, Jesus healed him. Let me be clear. Jesus was already in trouble with the Pharisees and the other religious leaders for doing things on the Sabbath day that weren't kosher in their eyes. Nevertheless, Jesus seemed to think that human need was more important than rules about what was right on certain days. Yes, certainly he could have healed the man on the next day. That's easy to say when it's not your hand that is withered, or when you aren't the one facing or enduring a crisis. If you are, the time for restoration and wholeness is now. So in that synagogue, Jesus called the man front and center while the Pharisees watched carefully. When Jesus asked them about the Sabbath rule versus human need, they stared back silently, and Mark tells us that Jesus looked around at them, all of them, with anger. Now, that's not how we normally picture Jesus. Most of us have an image of a serene, placid Jesus moving gently through life. But Mark tells us that Jesus looked with anger, and you might even say strong anger. And that got me to thinking. What emotions do the gospel writers describe Jesus as having, and when did he have them? So this week we're going to explore an emotional Jesus. One of the chief emotions Jesus showed was compassion. There are many examples in the Gospels of Jesus showing compassion. Very early in his ministry, in the first chapter of Mark, we find the story of a leper who came and knelt before Jesus, saying, "If you choose, you can make me clean." In his very next line, Mark tells us that Jesus was moved with pity. "I do choose," Jesus said, "be made clean." It's clear that Jesus felt compassion for this man and wanted to help him. But there are some special things to note in this story. There are some ancient manuscripts that use the word anger instead of pity. Those versions say, Jesus looked at the leper and was moved with anger. What could Jesus be angry at? Well, he could have been angry at all that this man was forced to endure with this illness, all the isolation from his loved ones and society, as well as the illness itself. He could have been moved to anger over a broken world where illness and isolation and pain happen. Whatever it was, Jesus' anger moved him to compassion for this man, and he healed him. But there's something else we may have overlooked as well. Mark tells us that Jesus stretched out his hand and healed the leper. Astoundingly, Jesus touched the leper. This was forbidden, but you yourself know that when someone is hurting, we want to hold them close. When someone is hurting, they need to be touched and held. That's the level of Jesus' compassion. In another story in Luke, Jesus has come to a town called Nain, and as he arrived, a funeral procession is exiting the town, carrying the dead son of a widow. He was her only son, and so her future was bleak, with no one left to care for her. Luke tells us that Jesus had compassion for her and told her not to weep. Then he touched the funeral bier and told the dead man, "Young man, I say to you, rise." And the man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. No one asked Jesus to do this. He did it in compassion. In another well-known story, Jesus calls his disciples away to a deserted place for some time alone, but the crowd saw where they were going and got there ahead of them. All Jesus wanted was rest and quiet, but when he saw the crowds, Mark tells us he had compassion for them. And before this whole story is over, Jesus had fed a hungry crowd with a sack lunch of a couple of small fish and 5 fist-sized loaves of bread, and more. In his words and actions, he had fed them with the love and grace of God. Finally, for today, the gospel writer Matthew tells us that Jesus had been going about all the cities and villages teaching and curing the people. Then Matthew 9 says, when he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Oh, how often in our frantic, pell-mell world we feel that way. Oh, how often we need a shepherd. Oh, how often we need Jesus to have compassion on us. When they made our most recent hymnal, choices had to be made about which hymns to include and which ones weren't being used very often in order to leave them out. Unfortunately, one of my favorites didn't make the cut. Our previous hymnal had a hymn entitled, One There Is Above All Others, and I think it speaks powerfully of Jesus' compassion and our need for it in our lives. One there is above all others, well deserves the name of friend. His is love beyond a brother's, costly, free, and knows no end. They who once his kindness prove, find it everlasting love. Which of all our friends to save us could or would have shed his blood? But this Savior died to have us reconciled to him, in him to God. This was boundless love indeed. Jesus is the friend we need. When he lived on earth, they scorned him. Friend of sinners was his name. Though the angels have adored him, still he answers to that claim. Still he calls them dearest friends, and to all their needs attends. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.